I'm going to record. Did it say that it was record? Yep, saying it's
Yep.
recording.
Yep.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks, Shu, for agreeing to chat with me. Um, I'm going to use this probably both for my class as well as for my Substack. On the Substack, it'll just be audio most likely. But in the class, I'm using the anthology that we edited together, and a lot of the students probably have not read many short stories, or at least haven't read short stories since high school. They're not short story writers. And I'm interested in sort of demystifying the short story process for them and to show the students, how a writer conceives of a story and how and even why writing and reading stories is a valuable thing to do, especially in this age of social media and very quick messaging. The short story demands a lot more attention and a little time, leisure time as well. So I guess I want to talk to you about your story in the anthology. Um, I guess first of all, maybe if you could say a little bit about why you write short stories, how you started as a short story writer.
Okay. I actually, started when I was a little kid. I originally started writing essays because there was this children's column in the school in the newspaper, in the local newspaper, which would accept pieces. So, we wrote essays in school. So I just sent in essays and I got published. I wrote about, things that I thought were beautiful, things that I wanted to say something about, express an opinion. But then I also saw that you could turn in stories, you could make up stories. And as a kid, one of the things I very much wanted was to leave where I was, because I felt that my life was too constrained in Hong Kong.
Hmm.
I mean, I had a pretty happy childhood because my parents were, they were doing very well when I was young. But I also felt like a little bit of an oddball because we were immigrants, or rather, my parents were. I was born in Hong Kong, but my parents were immigrants. So they didn't completely fit into the local world. And so being different, I wrote in English for one thing, which, Chinese is the major language in Hong Kong. And although I spoke Chinese, I didn't write in Chinese because
Hmm.
my parents wanted us to be English speakers. And my parents didn't speak the local dialect that well. So I wrote these stories about escape. And my escape, of course, were very speculative as a kid. I wanted to fly in the sky. I wanted to live underground, undersea, because I read about mermaids and things like that. In fact, I read The Little Mermaid, Hans Christian Andersen's story. This is long before the movie came out. And I just love that idea that there were people under the sea, and I wanted to be a mermaid and swim there too. So I made up stuff like that. I know, otherwise, I inhabited lives that I thought would take me away from where I was. So that was my initial reason for writing. But as I got older, I realized that writing stories was a way of making sense of things that were difficult to understand. So when I was like 16, so these stories I wrote when I was like 10 and 11. So when I was about 16, a family friend's son who was 18 and about to start university was killed in this really awful camping accident. It was he had gone out camping. He was a Boy Scout. He had gone out camping, and there was this terrible rainstorm, and we had really bad typhoons, what we call typhoons in Hong Kong, just like you see in hurricanes in Florida. And he was trying to save another kid, and he
Hmm.
managed to save the kid, but he drowned.
Oh, wow.
He was a really terrific kid. I mean, he was like the model son, and it was our family doctor, and we were very close to this family. And we used to see them every Chinese New Year. We'd go visit them and all that. And he was like the older kid when this happened. I was like 11 at the time, when this happened. And I remember going to the funeral with my sister and not fully being able to understand what this was like. But when I was 16, I thought, I want to try to understand that funeral, because that was the first death of anybody that I knew.
Mhm.
And that, so I wrote about it. I recreated the funeral, and myself and my sister there in our dark blue dresses, trying to make sense of it, not being absolutely sure which kid this was that was killed, because he was so much older than us. He was always like the big brother friend, who
Uh-huh.
would like light fireworks and play with us. But we were closer to the kids in that family who were closer to our age. And so not completely understanding it. But by the time I was 16, I understood a lot more about how painful this was for his mother, because the mother, we had, it was both a Catholic funeral, because they were Catholics, and a Chinese funeral. So I was interested. I'd never seen this combination of funerals. So we went to the grave where he was buried, and the mother, they had to hold her to stop her from leaping into the grave. Um, and then in the Chinese funeral, which I'd never seen before, there were all these like mourners and things. So it was very colorful. So there was this, on the one hand, I wanted to recreate that experience because it was so fresh and new to me and so unknown. And I also wanted to try to understand the idea of death and grief. And so
Mhm.
that was a story I wrote when I was 16. I never published it, but it was, it
Yeah.
was just something I wrote to try to understand. And it helped me a little more in terms of understanding what death was.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
just kept doing that. And after that, you know, when things are difficult, things I don't understand, something new or interesting happens that I want to try to record, I like to make up a story around it.
So, yeah, thank you. Thanks for, I mean, I think that that's a really interesting notion, probably common among a lot of us who write short
Yes.
stories, the
Uh-huh.
desire to, on the one hand, entertain perhaps, but also to
Mhm.
understand the things that are most incomprehensible.
Mhm.
So why do you read short stories? Do you like short stories?
Yes, I do. I actually didn't even know they were short stories. I think the only ones I read, I don't even remember reading them in high school. So when I got to college, I took a creative writing class. And that was the first time I was introduced to short stories as something you could read. Because my idea of literature were like novels or poetry, because that's all we were taught in school.
Uh-huh.
Nobody really gave us a short story to read, But then in college, I got short stories, and I was like, oh my God, there are all these stories. And then we had to read Edgar Allan Poe and all that. And I just found that there was this very rich literature in English of short stories, especially in America, because America has, I think, mastered the short story in a way in the English language. But I started then looking for more after I finished college, and because they in the creative writing class, the professor introduced us to the literary journals that publish short. I didn't even know these things existed, and so I think I got the subscription to the New Yorker. I started reading that, and at that time there were a lot more magazines that did it. And I knew, and in school we could go to the library and read them all. But once I graduated, I couldn't afford to buy everything, so I just like would either subscribe to one and then or then stop that and start another one. And I tried to read that way.
Well, do you think that short stories now, I mean, you said that there are fewer magazines
Mhm.
that publish, although there's more on the internet,
Mm.
more on the internet, but do you still think that short stories have a place, or are they dinosaurs? Do you think that they,
I actually think they have a bigger place now because of the internet. I mean, I had to like I went home to Hong Kong because I was a foreign student in America at the time. So I went home to Hong Kong after I graduated. And imagine having to have something mailed to you by sea mail back then, and you had to wait forever to get a copy to read.
yeah.
Today you can just Google and find so many. All the top magazines have a internet version as well. And what I really found interesting were the new internet magazines, internet only, so virtual magazines only. And in a way, today too, we're more conscious of, the environment, and maybe we should be chopping down all these trees to make magazines. And I actually think it makes more sense to read on the internet. Um, Also, I think what I like about that access is that I can read from so many different places, and I can read from stories from all over the world, which was a lot harder to do. So, I actually think that this is a great time for short stories. I think it's better than it's ever been. And I love reading on the internet now.
Great. Well, do you write stories from your real life or from your real experience?
Um, yes, quite. In fact, I would say most of my stories come from some kind of experience. Sometimes the experience is more in terms of something I just happen to observe, like something really beautiful or some image that just stays with me, and I make up a story entirely around that. But I would say more often though. I mean, because especially when I was younger, that tended to be the case. Some of my earliest stories were really like I'd see something. The subway when it first opened in Hong Kong, there was this yellow line, and then they would have an announcement: please stand behind the yellow line, the train for so and so. And I was fascinated because I'd never been on a subway in my life at that point. This was like in 1978 or whatever. It was the first time I had ever seen. I'd only been on the New York City subway once when I was in college, and somebody took me on it. So I didn't really know subway culture. So this was like fascinating to me to see it in Hong Kong. And that yellow line just became the image that I was fascinated by. And I made up a whole story around, a little kid who's seeing it for the first time. So I use a little kid because I felt like a little kid.
Mm.
But I think in later years, more of my stories are mostly drawn from something that's happened in life, something either I've experienced personally, or I know of a friend or somebody I know who had the experience, and I adapt that into a story. Or if it's more, because in recent years I've written more speculative, almost sci-fi kind of stories,
Yeah.
including the one like in the book that we have. Um, those draw on sort of really deeper emotional experiences that I don't have a good way to write about. And I can't just tell, how I felt, because that's not enough. And I try to take these complicated emotions that confuse me, and I create a story that provides a metaphor for me to, or, a narrative platform for me to explore all those emotions.
So yeah, so along those lines with All About Skin, would you say it's an autobiographical story?
In a sense, yes. Although, of course, it never happened like that, because we don't actually, unfortunately, we can't just change skin as we would like. Um, it started off as a story about, well, I always had the idea of this skin thing, but it started out as a story of kind of wanting to talk about marketing, because I had a long career in marketing, and how we market products and make up things around. I used to write copy as well. You make up things around different products, and in a way, how ridiculous some of that was, how exaggerated. So I just like pushed it to the limit. But it took me a very long time to write that story. It went through many iterations, and I changed it and I left it, and it took years. And finally, I realized I'm also really talking about identity. I mean, I knew that to some extent at the beginning, but I didn't quite understand it. And I'd always felt a little bit outside of my own skin. Um, and I wanted to sort of express that. But I couldn't actually write it until I came up, until it was a friend of mine actually who had um, a surgical procedure that was, cosmetic, and she was describing it, and I was just kind of like fascinated. But this is something I've never done, and she's one of these people who's very attractive, society kind of person. So these sort of things are important, and I thought that's what I've got to do. I've got to push it into that kind of, cosmetic sort of thing. And once I knew that, I started researching everything I could about skin, because originally it was less skin-like and more just kind of, it was a little bit more surface. It was more like advertising, marketing language. And then I pushed it to its limit. And then the story came out. So
Yeah,
it is autobiographical in that I have worked in marketing and I have traveled and purchased things in Paris and in New York and really wanted certain like designer products, for example. And at the same time thinking, this is really ridiculous. They're asking me to pay so much money for this outfit, or usually outfits, clothes, which cost so much, and for what? It's just fashion.
yeah.
But fashion was really at the root of it too, and I didn't understand it until I had my girlfriend do this, tell me the story, and she's very fashion conscious. So I was like, oh, okay, this is about fashion on some level too.
Yeah, but as you say, it's also, it's identity and um, it's not it is, I suppose it's obviously a story about marketing,
Mhm.
but the autobiographical thing, because I've known you for many years
Mhm.
and you talk about this a lot, this notion that so I mean your company is called Mongrel
Yeah,
in
I know. Yeah.
and to some degree, you consider yourself and are proud of being a mongrel,
Uh-huh.
in that sense, and that you were born in Hong Kong, but your family has roots also in Indonesia, Chinese Indonesian. And so there's that sense. It struck me how you said that I've always felt a little outside of my skin. And that seems to me really driving the story, the notion
Mhm.
of this discomfort that you have or that one has. I mean, a lot of people have that, including
Mhm.
myself, of being confined, let's say, to one identity and wanting to sort of or, show the other aspects of one's identity or the other
Mhm.
possibilities. So, is that close to sort of some of the deeper autobiographical thread?
That is pretty close. One of the very first stories I published as an adult, I had a main character who was a child who was Eurasian. She was
Mhm.
part white American and part Chinese Malaysian. And Malaysian, of course, is very close to Indonesian.
Right.
And her parents were divorced. Um, and after it was published, my father read it. My father, who hardly ever reads anything I write because he doesn't understand fiction, that's what he always says. But he read that. This was my very, very first story published in a literary journal when I was an adult. And afterwards, he said to me, I see that you have thought of yourself as a Eurasian, that you feel somewhat Eurasian. And I thought that was very astute of him because I'm not physically Eurasian. I have no white blood. I have, Chinese and Indonesian blood. Those that's my ethnicity.
Right.
But I speak English. I became an American in a world which, at a time when it was a much more white American world.
Yeah.
So yes, I realized I did feel Eurasian, even though I wasn't. Uh, and so that I was trying on an identity in that story in a way.
Right.
Um, and I thought that was astute because, in a way, this story does try on lots of different identities. And I understand that in a way, having lived in different places and having become, I immigrated to America. I'm a first generation American, which um, most Asian American writers I know are not. They're like second or third generation. And they're very American. And I don't write like them because I don't have the same stories.
Right.
I have a different story. So this was my way of saying I have to try on all these different identities because I'm a bit of everything. I
Right.
I don't have a stable single identity. Whereas I think Asian Americans have a much more stable. Asian American writers who write about that Asian American identity and immigrant experience of their families and all that, they have a much more stable identity as Americans who are of Asian ethnicity. And often they also do a root search, going back to China, like Amy Tan, for example. Her books often speak to China and Chinese culture, whereas I'm like, I grew up in Chinese culture. It's not unusual to me, and I speak Cantonese fluently. So it's very different. My search is for something else. It's like, well, where do I belong in the world since I don't fit anywhere?
But isn't there some instability? Well, I don't want to get too much into this because it's a big subject, but the
Mhm.
sense that um, I would say that a lot of Asian American writers, in my experience, have that sense of instability of identity
Yes.
because of sort of having that connection to, let's say, the mother country, but
Uh-huh.
also not really knowing, I mean, sort of being in between too, in
Yes.
between being American, but also having that very strong literary identity
Mhm.
associated with with wherever it is, whether it's Lebanon
Mhm.
or China or Japan. And so, I just think that I actually think that instability of identity is kind of part of being a writer. Why we,
Yeah, I think it is. I think most writers have a certain instability, otherwise they wouldn't bother writing. But I think most people are a little, you know, I think life,
yeah,
the existential crisis we all face is the instability of existence.
yeah,
Um, Except that I think writers tend to be able to parse out those bits in their particular circumstance and turn it into stories,
right,
and
right,
that just is our tendency.
right, right. Well, well, are there any particular insights that you think, anything you'd like to share with the students as a kind of last thing on, the story all about skin in terms of maybe something that that surprised you when you wrote it?
Mm. Um, yes, I think for me, the original title of the story was My American Skin,
Oh, right. I remember that.
which so in other words, I thought I was writing about my adopting this American identity.
Right,
And in fact, that's really not all that the story is about.
right.
And that's why in the final analysis, it became all about skin. I think the most important thing about trying to write and finish a short story is you've got to understand what you're really writing about. You may start off thinking, oh, this is what I'm doing. But by the time you really sort of explore all the different parts of it, and you have to have a little patience to let that come out, um, you begin to understand what it's really about, and then you'll find the right voice or the right storyline or the right framework for it. And it took me a long time, but not all stories. I mean, other stories have taken me one day to write. So it varies depending on the story. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that sense of uncertainty is something that short story writers like.
Mhm.
Maybe a lot of other, say, academic writers and such might not like it as much. I think it,
No.
but I think it's part and parcel actually of all the writing process. Even when you're writing an academic paper, you might think you're starting off with something, a
Sure.
thesis, but you discover you feel differently about something.
Oh,
And
for sure. I mean, any academic papers and presentations I've done, you do start one way, and then by the time you're done, you go, oh, well, actually, what I really wanted to say was this, and you have to go back and start
yeah,
over again. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Shu. I really appreciate your time and, of course, your story. And I think this is you've given us some insights into your process, and I
Okay.
appreciate it.
Well, I hope it's helpful.
Definitely. Okay. Thanks. I'll
Thanks.
see you later. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.